3 lighthouse keepers vanished from a remote Scottish island. Their logbook told of a violent storm that raged for days, waves crashing against the tower, men reduced to tears by the fury of nature. But Captain Marshall's own weather records revealed an impossible truth. During those same days, the sea was perfectly calm. No storm had ever occurred. What drives experienced men to madness when the world outside is silent? And what kind of tempest rages only in the human mind? The office of the Northern Lighthouse Board was a room built to outlast men. Its walls were panelled in dark mahogany that had soaked up decades of expensive pipe smoke, and its authority was upholstered in cracked leather. It smelled of old paper, coal fire, and the quiet, stubborn certainty of the British Empire. It was December 1900, and the world was supposed to be a place of rules, of schedules, of things that ran on time. Captain James Marshall stood before the desk of Mr. Hines, a man who seemed to have been carved from the same mahogany as the walls. At 60, Hines was less a person and more a function of the board, a human cog whose primary concern was that all the other cogs in his vast machine turned without incident. "The light at Eilean Mor has been dark for 9 days, Captain," Hines said, his voice as dry as old parchment. He did not look at Marshall, but rather at a point on the wall just over his shoulder, as if addressing the abstract concept of a problem. The steamer Archer noted it on its passage from Philadelphia. That was 4 days ago. We had hoped it was a temporary fault. Marshall's posture was that of a man accustomed to the immutable laws of physics. He was in his 40s, with a steady gaze that had measured horizons and a pragmatist's economy of movement. "Temporary faults don't last 9 days, Mr. Hines. What were the last recorded weather patterns in that sector? Inclement, but nothing a Flannan Isles lighthouse isn't built to withstand," Hines replied, finally sliding a thin file across the polished expanse of the desk. "Your orders, Captain. The relief vessel Hesperus is ready for you. You are to sail at once, land your supplies, and ascertain the nature of the fault." He paused, tapping a finger on the file. "The keepers are Thomas Marshall, no relation, I believe James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur. All good men, experienced." The names were delivered with the same detached professionalism as the weather report. Marshall picked up the file. His questions were sharp, practical, a surgeon's tools seeking the edges of a wound. Was there relief tender on schedule? It was not. Weather delays. Any other signal failures reported in the area? None. And the men? Any history of difficulties? Hines finally met Marshall's gaze, and for a moment, the bureaucrat was replaced by something colder. "The Northern Lighthouse Board does not employ men with difficulties, Captain. This is a procedural failure, an equipment malfunction. I trust you will find a simple mechanical explanation. We prefer our mysteries to have tidy mechanical solutions. A quiet resolution is paramount." Marshall understood. The board was not concerned for the 3 men on that rock so much as it was concerned for the integrity of its system. A dark lighthouse was a flaw in the system, a crack in the clockwork of the world. His job was not one of rescue, it was one of repair. He gave a single sharp nod. "Understood, sir. I'll have an explanation for you." The supply ship Hesperus was a workhorse, not a stallion. It moved through the choppy, slate-grey sea with a stolid, uncomplaining rhythm, its prow slicing through swells the colour of wet iron. Above, the sky was a featureless blanket, a lid on a world of cold water and colder air. Captain Marshall stood on the deck, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He observed the patterns of the waves, the direction of the wind, the subtle language of the ocean. It was a language he understood, a text written in the unassailable grammar of tide and pressure. A young crewman named Baird approached him, his movements nervous and skittish, as if the deck were pitching more than it was. "We'll be making sight of the Flannans by afternoon, Captain," he said, his voice carrying the soft burr of the Outer Hebrides. Marshall nodded, not taking his eyes off the sea. "That we will, Mr. Baird." Baird hesitated, wringing his hands in his woolen gloves. "It's just the men are talking, about the island, Eilean Mor." He lowered his voice, as if the wind itself might be listening. "They call it the other country, Captain. A place not entirely of this world." Marshall turned his head slightly, his expression one of polite, academic curiosity. "Do they now?" "Aye," Baird pressed on, emboldened. "They say it's haunted, that the ghosts of sailors lost to the sea wander the cliffs, and the little people, the fairy folk. They say the island belongs to them, that the lighthouse is an affront." Marshall finally faced the young man. He wasn't unkind, but his gaze was direct, leaving no room for shadows. "Mr. Baird," he said, his voice calm and measured, "what your shipmates are experiencing is a combination of barometric pressure changes affecting their inner ear and a common psychological response to isolated environments. The haunting sounds they speak of are most likely aeolian tones, wind passing through rock formations of a specific shape. And as for the magnetic properties of the island, the high iron content in the gneiss rock can cause minor compass deviations, which a superstitious mind might interpret as an unnatural influence." He placed a steady hand on the ship's railing. "There are no phantoms here, Mr. Baird. There is only wind, water, and rock. My world has no room for anything else. See to your duties." Baird stared for a moment, his folklore dissected and laid bare like a biological specimen. He nodded mutely and retreated, leaving Marshall alone once more with the vast, rational, and entirely unmagical sea. The jagged black cliffs of Eilean Mor rose from the churning ocean like the teeth of some colossal, long-drowned beast. It was a place forged in violence, all sharp angles and unforgiving stone, with no hint of softness or welcome, and perched atop it, a white spear against the oppressive grey sky, was the lighthouse. It stood stark, remote, and unnervingly silent. The Hesperus anchored a safe distance away, the rhythmic clang of its engine falling quiet, leaving a void that was filled only by the crash of waves and the cry of gulls. On the bridge, Marshall held a pair of brass binoculars to his eyes, sweeping the island. The landing stage appeared intact. The iron railings leading up the steep path were visible. The lighthouse tower itself looked perfect, untouched by any storm. But something was deeply wrong. The flagstaff was bare. No salt-stained Union Jack fluttered in the wind to greet the relief vessel. There was no one on the catwalk, no figure hurrying down the path. There was no sign of life at all. "Sound the horn," Marshall commanded, his voice tight. A lever was pulled, and the ship's steam horn unleashed a deep, mournful blast. The sound rolled across the water, struck the cliffs of Eilean Mor, and echoed back, distorted and faint. It was an immense, lonely sound, a question asked to an empty room. They waited. The gulls circled. The waves crashed. The silence from the island was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the horn's call. "Again," Marshall ordered. The second blast was more urgent, more demanding. It bellowed across the sea, a desperate shout into the void. And again, the void shouted back nothing. The lighthouse stood impassive, its single glass eye blind and indifferent. The mission was no longer about a broken lamp or a delayed report. The sight of the lifeless tower, standing sentinel over 3 vanished men, confirmed the true gravity of their purpose. They were not here for repair. They were here for an answer. And the silence of Eilean Mor was the most terrifying answer he could have imagined. The heavy wooden door of the lighthouse was unlocked. It swung inward with a low groan, a sound of protest from long unmoved hinges. Marshall and Baird stepped across the threshold, and the sound of the sea and wind was instantly muted, replaced by a profound and chilling stillness. The air inside was colder than it was outside, a deep, cellar-like cold that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. They were in the kitchen and living area, the heart of the keeper's small world. It was a scene frozen in the middle of a breath. A thick wooden table was set for a meal. On one plate sat a piece of bread and a slice of salt beef, a single bite taken from it. A fork lay beside it, as if just set down. One of the 3 chairs was knocked over, its legs pointing accusingly at the ceiling. It looked as though its occupant had left in a sudden, violent hurry. On the wall, a pendulum clock, the room's mechanical heartbeat, was silent, its hands frozen at 5 minutes past 9. Time itself had died here. Baird made a small, involuntary sound, a half-swallowed gasp. His eyes were wide, darting from one strange detail to the next. But Marshall's face became a mask of professional control. This was no longer a place of human habitation. It was a scene, a collection of data points to be observed and catalogued. He methodically removed a small, leather-bound notebook and a pencil from his coat pocket. His movements were precise, economical. He did not touch anything. He started with a rough sketch of the room's layout, marking the position of the table, the chairs, the cold hearth. He noted the state of the meal, the make of the stopped clock, the layer of dust that had begun to settle on every surface. He was a scientist, imposing the grid of logic onto a canvas of profound chaos. Every line he drew, every note he scribbled, was an attempt to wrestle the scene back from the edge of the inexplicable. He was not just documenting what he saw, he was fighting it, trying to contain its madness within the clean, rational lines of his notebook. Leaving Baird in the unsettling stillness of the kitchen, Marshall moved deeper into the tower. The keeper's sleeping quarters were just as orderly and just as unnerving. The small circular room was immaculately tidy. 2 of the 3 bunks were made with military precision, the blankets pulled taut. The third was left as if the sleeper had just risen, the sheets turned down, but not in disarray. Small wooden plaques on the wall bore the keeper's names: Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, Donald MacArthur. Marshall's methodical investigation continued. He noted the names assigned to each bunk. He observed the state of the beds, the neatly folded clothes at the foot of 2 of them. Then he turned to a large wooden wardrobe against the curved wall. He opened it. Inside hung a single set of oilskins, the heavy, waterproof gear essential for any work outside in the brutal North Atlantic weather. 1 set. There should have been 3. His brow furrowed. He closed the wardrobe and opened it again, as if the missing garments might reappear. They did not. 2 sets of oilskins were gone. He stood there, the cold of the room seeping into his bones, and let his mind work. This was the process he trusted, the methodical engine of hypothesis and falsification. Hypothesis 1, a sudden emergency. 2 men, Ducat and the other marshal, were on duty and rushed outside. But why would an emergency require 2 men? And what kind of emergency was it? And why would they leave MacArthur behind? Hypothesis 2, an accident during a storm. 2 men were swept from the cliffs. This would explain the missing oilskins. But it didn't explain the state of the kitchen, the overturned chair, the half-eaten meal that spoke of an event that happened inside the tower, not out on the windswept rock. Furthermore, it didn't explain why the 3rd man, presumably safe inside, had also vanished, leaving his foul weather gear behind. He paced the small room, his footsteps the only sound. Every theory he constructed was immediately contradicted by another piece of evidence. 2 men go out, 1 stays. The one who stays also disappears. The event inside seems disconnected from the evidence of men going outside. The pieces refuse to form a coherent whole. For the first time, Marshall felt a flicker of something other than professional curiosity. It was the deep, intellectual frustration of a mathematician staring at an equation that could not be solved. He was deconstructing the scene with the tools of science, but the grammar of this place was broken. He had to go up. The answers, or at least the data, had to be in the lantern room, the brain of the tower. He ascended the winding spiral staircase, his hand trailing along the cold iron railing. With each step, the world outside shrank, visible in slices through the thick-paned windows. He reached the top and entered the glass-encased chamber that housed the light itself. The giant lens, a magnificent Fresnel array of interlocking prisms, was cold and inert, its crystalline surfaces reflecting the dim grey light in 1,000 dead facets. And there, on a small wooden desk, tucked against the inner wall, he saw it, or the official Lighthouse Logbook, a thick, stoutly bound volume that represented procedure, order, and fact. Marshall felt a wave of profound relief wash over him. The chaos below was human, emotional, and contradictory. But this was data. Verifiable, sequential, objective data. He lit the oil lamp on the desk, and a warm orange glow pushed back against the oppressive grey, giving the room a sense of life. He sat down and pulled the logbook towards him. He opened it with a reverence he hadn't known he possessed. Here, at last, was the world he understood. His finger traced the neat columns and the precise, looping script of the keeper. He began to read the entries for the first week of December. December 7th, wind NW, barometer 29.8. Lamp polished, mechanism wound, all in order. December 8th, wind W, sea calm, minor repairs to landing crane winch. MacArthur in good spirits, all in order. December 9th, fog in morning, cleared by noon, read from Burns. Ducat mending boots, all in order. Marshall read on, his shoulders relaxing with every mundane, professional, and reassuringly boring entry. This was the steady rhythm of life in the tower, the predictable beat of men doing their duty. This was the baseline of normalcy, the solid ground from which he could measure the deviation. He clung to these simple, orderly facts as a shield, the last bastion of reason against the silent, screaming chaos in the rooms below. He had found his anchor. Now, he could begin to understand the storm. The orange lamplight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the curved walls of the lantern room. For a time, the only sounds were the rustle of the thick pages and Marshall's own steady breathing. The logbook was his sanctuary, a fortress of facts. But as his finger traced the lines of ink past the first week of December, the foundation of that fortress began to tremble. The handwriting, once so neat and controlled, grew subtly more energetic, the loops and crosses of the letters sharper, as if pressed into the paper with a new and urgent force. He continued to read, and the dispassionate voice of the narrator in his head was slowly replaced by another, the imagined voice of the keeper, Thomas Marshall. December 10th, rain, heavy swell, wind southerly. Ducat seems irritable, a minor note, but a personal one, the first crack in the professional facade. December 11th, gale force winds, sea spray obscuring the glass, confined to tower, God save us. The phrase hung in the air, a sudden jarring plea in a document of scientific observation. Marshall's posture stiffened slightly. He read on, his finger moving to the next entry. The keeper's voice in his mind was now strained, tinged with a fear that seemed to seep from the ink itself. December 12th, severe winds, the like of which I have never seen in 20 years. The tower shudders. Had to crawl to the entrance to check the ropes. The sea is a wall of white. Marshall could almost see it, a man on his hands and knees, the wind screaming like a banshee around him. He turned the page. The entries were becoming more than a record. They were a testament. December 13th. The storm has not abated. We are trapped. James Ducat is very quiet. He just sits and stares at the wall. Donald MacArthur has been weeping. The words hit Marshall like a physical blow. Weeping. A lighthouse keeper? A man chosen for his fortitude and resilience, reduced to tears. In the flickering lamplight, Marshall saw a flash of a man's face, coarse and weathered, with tears tracking through the salt and pepper bristles of his thick beard. He saw the despair in his eyes. The objective record was gone, washed away by a tide of raw human terror. This was no longer a logbook. It was a diary of three men losing their minds at the edge of the world. Marshall S. Hart was now hammering against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the silence of the tower. He knew he was approaching the end of the record, the final communication from the lost men. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he turned to the last written page. The handwriting was now a barely controlled scrawl, the words tumbling over each other. It was dated December 15th. Storm past. Sea calm. God is over all. A wave of confusion washed over him. The storm was over? The sea was calm? He read the entry again. It was a statement of relief, of survival. But if the storm had passed, where were they? Why was the meal uneaten? Why was the clock stopped? Nothing made sense. The final entry was not a conclusion. It was the most baffling contradiction of all. Then a thought struck him, a cold, sharp splinter of an idea. He stood so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. Moving with a new urgency, he went to the small satchel he'd brought up from the Hesperus and retrieved his own ship S-log. He placed it on the desk beside the keeper's diary of madness. The two books lay side by side, one filled with a phantom storm, the other with the cold, hard facts of his own journey. He wet his thumb and flipped through the pages of his log, his eyes scanning the columns of dates, barometer readings, and weather observations. He found the corresponding dates: December 12th, December 13th, December 14th. His blood ran cold. The entries in his own log, cross-referenced with the official reports he'd reviewed from the mainland station, were unequivocal. The weather in the Flannan Isles on those days had been perfectly, unnaturally calm. The wind was light, the sea was placid. There had been no gale, there had been no sea spray obscuring the glass. There was no storm. Marshall leaned back, the truth hitting him with the force of a physical impact. He stared at the keeper's logbook, at the desperate scrawled account of a tempest that had never happened. It was a fiction, a shared delusion. The logbook in front of him was not a record of weather. It was a record of madness. The solid ground he had been standing on simply dissolved, plunging him into an abyss of uncertainty. The men hadn't been fighting the sea. They had been fighting the phantoms in their own minds. Shaking, Marshall pushed himself away from the desk and stumbled out of the lantern room, gasping for air as if he had been submerged. He found himself on the narrow iron catwalk that encircled the top of the tower. The night was breathtakingly still. A bone-white half-moon hung in a sky strewn with crystalline stars. Below, the sea was a sheet of dark, polished glass, placid and calm, the gentle swells whispering against the base of the rock. The silence was absolute, immense. He gripped the cold iron railing, his knuckles white. He was trying to reconcile the two realities. The serene, peaceful world spread before him, and the screaming tempest described in the logbook. His mind, the precise, logical instrument he had trusted his entire life, was failing him. The world was lying. Or the book was. And the book was the only evidence he had. He leaned against the railing, closing his eyes, trying to force the world to make sense again. And then he heard it. At the very edge of his perception, drifting from the island's dark, sleeping interior, it was a faint, rhythmic sound. It was low and mournful, a sound that seemed to carry an ancient sorrow. It could have been the wind passing through a uniquely shaped cleft in the rock. It could have been the echo of the sea sighing in a distant cove. But to his frayed and terrified nerves, it sounded unnervingly like a chant, a low, keening lament that rose and fell with a desolate cadence. He opened his eyes, searching the darkness. There was nothing there, only rock and shadow and the indifferent moon. It's fatigue, he told himself. It's the wind. It is a trick of the mind. But he could not unhear it. The seed of doubt, planted by the impossible logbook, had taken root. For the first time in his life, Captain James Marshall was no longer sure if he was the observer or if he, too, was becoming a symptom of the islander's strange and terrible disease. Sleep offered Marshall no escape. The mournful, rhythmic sound he'd heard or imagined on the catwalk echoed in his mind, a persistent, unignorable note of discord. When dawn broke, painting the grey sea with pale, watery light, he rose with a grim purpose. He needed facts. He needed solid, tangible evidence that could silence the phantom chant and anchor him once more in the world of measurable reality. The logbook had mentioned the western landing stage, a treacherous spot used only in the calmest weather to hoist supplies up the sheer cliffs. He gathered a small search party, including the still nervous Baird, and they made their way out of the lighthouse. The island's western face was a nightmare of shattered rock and steep, unforgiving inclines. They picked their way carefully, the sea churning menacingly below. Here, they found the crane used for supplies, a skeletal iron arm bolted into the rock. Its ropes were in disarray, whipped by wind and spray into a tangled mess. It told a story of neglect, but not necessarily of tragedy. Then, Baird, perched precariously on a lower ledge, called out, "Captain, down here!" Marshall scrambled down to join him. There, tangled in the black, seaweed-slick rocks just above the waterline, was a length of thick, coarse rope. It was frayed and battered, clearly torn from the crane above. And as Marshall stared at it, a wave of profound, intoxicating relief washed over him. He felt his shoulders, tense for what felt like days, finally relax. It was evidence. Real, physical, incontrovertible evidence. He could see it all now, a clean, tragic, and entirely rational sequence of events. A storm, a real one, this time had begun to brew. The keepers, ever dutiful, had gone out to the exposed western landing to secure the crane and its valuable ropes. As they worked, a single, monstrous wave, a rogue wave, unpredicted and unpredictable, had reared up from the sea and crashed over them. A wall of water that would have plucked them from the rocks like insects and thrown them into the churning abyss. It explained everything. The 2 missing sets of oilskins, the 3rd man left behind who perhaps rushed out to help, the unlocked door. It was a perfect, terrible, scientific explanation. An accident, a brutal act of nature. Marshall's relief was so intense, it was almost dizzying. Science had won. He had found his tidy mechanical solution. He returned to the lighthouse, his stride confident for the first time since setting foot on the island. He found Mr. Hines in the kitchen, observing the scene with a look of profound distaste, as if the frozen meal and overturned chair were a personal affront to his sense of order. Marshall, holding the frayed piece of rope like a trophy, presented his rogue wave theory. Hines' face, etched with worry, cleared instantly. He seized upon the explanation like a drowning man grabbing a life raft. "A rogue wave," he repeated, the words a calming balm. "Of course, tragic, an act of God." He clapped his hands together with an air of finality. "A tragic accident. Case closed. Well done, Captain. You've found the answer." Hines was already turning to leave, his mind moving on to the logistics of their departure. "Now, if you would be so good as to finalize your report, we can leave this dreadful place to its ghosts. The board will need a simple, conclusive statement." But Marshall did not move. He stood in the center of the cold kitchen, the triumphant feeling of his discovery already beginning to curdle. He looked at the stopped clock on the wall, its hands still pointing to 9:05. He looked at the plate of cold, congealed food. "Mr. Hines," he began, his voice hesitant. "The theory fits the evidence at the landing, but it doesn't fit the evidence in here, or in the log." Hines turned back, his face clouded with impatience. "What are you talking about, man? It's a perfect explanation." "The logbook," Marshall pressed, his own doubt returning with a vengeance. Keeper Marshall wrote of the storm raging for days before they could have been at the West Landing. Days before this rogue wave could have struck. The timeline is wrong. Hines waved a dismissive hand, his voice laced with the cold pragmatism Marshall now recognized as cynical indifference. "The men were clearly under duress, Captain. You said it yourself, the log reads like a madman's diary. Their minds were addled by the isolation and the wind. They lost track of time. They were hallucinating. The wave is the fact. The rest is just noise." He gestured around the room. "This is what fear looks like. But fear is not evidence. The rope is evidence. Write the report." Hines was weaponizing skepticism, using the very tool Marshall revered to dismiss the part of the truth that was inconvenient. He was being told to choose the easy lie over the difficult, unprovable truth. To declare the keepers mad and leave it at that. As Hines walked out, leaving Marshall alone with the silent, accusing evidence of the room, he knew he couldn't do it. Sleep was an impossibility. The conversation with Hines replayed in his mind, a loop of cynical pragmatism and nagging doubt. Marshall found himself drawn back up the spiral staircase, back to the lantern room, the single lamp casting its lonely orange glow. He needed to see the words again. He sat at the desk, the keeper's logbook open before him. He ignored the frantic entries about the phantom storm and focused on the very last line, written after the terror had supposedly passed. Storm past. Sea calm. God is over all. He stared at the sentence until the words blurred. Hines' explanation echoed in his ears. A rogue wave. A sudden violent event. But the logbook flatly contradicted it. The keeper, Thomas Marshall, had written this after the storm, in a state of calm. Why? Marshall asked the silent room. Would 3 experienced keepers venture out onto the most treacherous part of the island to secure ropes after the danger was over? When the sea was calm, it made no tactical sense. It violated every procedure, every instinct a keeper would have. The official story, the one Hines was so eager to accept, the one that had given him such a profound sense of relief only hours before, fell apart under the weight of that single impossible sentence. It was a lie, a neat, tidy, convenient lie. A cold certainty settled over Marshall. He was no longer investigating an accident. He was no longer trying to find a rational explanation for a physical event. He now knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his soul, that the ropes and the crane were a red herring. The truth was not on the rocks below. The truth was here, in this room, embedded in the ink of this book. He had to understand the phantom storm. He was now fully committed to the psychological puzzle, to investigating not a tragedy, but a shared delusion. He had to descend into the madness with them. The sky, which had been a passive grey, began to curdle, darkening to the colour of a deep bruise. The wind, which had been a whisper, began to moan, then to howl. A real storm, born of low pressure and cold fronts, was bearing down on Eilean Mor. Soon, the lighthouse, which had been a silent tomb, became a drum, beaten by a furious onslaught of wind and water. Marshall was trapped inside, alone. The sea, which had been a placid mirror, rose up in a rage, hurling itself against the stone tower in thunderous, percussive blasts. The physical reality of the storm merged with the phantom storm of the logbook. The howling of the wind was the scream of Donald MacArthur. The shuddering of the tower was the trembling of James Duckett's hands. The darkness pressing against the lantern room glass was the encroaching madness. Marshall, caught in the heart of the tempest, lost his grip on the present. The line between observer and participant, between 1900 and a week ago, dissolved completely. He was no longer investigating the mystery, he was living it. In a visceral, terrifying fugue state, he saw them. The small living space was no longer empty, but crowded with the unbearable tension of 3 men trapped in a cage of stone and fear. He saw the eldest keeper, MacArthur, the veteran of 100 storms, curled on his bunk, his body racked with silent, terrified sobs. He saw Ducat, his face a mask of strained patience, trying to console him, murmuring words that were lost in the shriek of the non-existent wind, and he saw the youngest, Thomas Marshall, his namesake, his eyes wide with a terror that had finally boiled over. He saw the boy, for he was just a boy, suddenly stand up, his face pale and slick with sweat. He saw him scream, a thin, sharp sound of a mind snapping in two, not at the storm, but at the suffocating silence, at the weeping of his elder, at the crushing weight of isolation. Marshall watched in his mind's eye as Thomas threw open the heavy door and ran out into the calm, placid evening, seeking escape in a storm that wasn't there. Then, the final, tragic act of duty. He saw Ducat and MacArthur, their own fear momentarily eclipsed by their responsibility for the boy. Without stopping to grab their oilskins, they charged out after him into the phantom gale, two good men running to save a third from his own mind. He saw the heavy door, not properly latched, swing shut in a gust of wind that never was, its thick bolt clicking into place. He saw it all. And in the heart of the roaring, actual storm, surrounded by the ghosts of their choices, he finally, horribly, understood. The storm passed. Dawn broke, pale and grey, over a sea that was once again calm. The light that filtered into the kitchen was thin and watery, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the silent air. Marshall sat at the keeper's table, in the very chair that had been knocked over. He was hollowed out, his body thrumming with an exhaustion so profound it felt like a sickness, but his eyes, when he finally lifted them, were clear. The terror had passed, scoured from him by the night's ordeal, and in its place was a profound, sorrowful, and absolute understanding. The door creaked open, and Mr. Hines entered, his face haggard from a sleepless night aboard the rocking Hesperus. He saw Marshall sitting there, motionless, a spectre at a frozen feast. "Have you finished your report, Captain?" Hines asked, his voice rough with fatigue and impatience. He just wanted to leave. Marshall didn't look at him at first. His gaze drifted around the silent kitchen, at the stopped clock, at the half-eaten meal, at the ghosts only he could see. He had the answer Hines wanted, and he had the truth. He turned his head slowly and met the bureaucrat-esque gaze. "I have my conclusion," he said, his voice quiet but firm, the voice of a man who had returned from a very long and distant journey. The Hesperus sliced through the calm morning sea, sailing away from the haunting silhouette of Eilean Mor. In his cabin, Captain Marshall sat at his small desk, the keeper's logbook lying closed beside his own official report. A pen was in his hand, the nib scratched rhythmically against the paper, the only sound in the cabin besides the gentle creak of the ship's timbers. He was writing the story the world was prepared to hear, the story that could be filed and forgotten. Fragments of the official narrative appeared under his hand. Evidence suggests the men were attending to the Western Crane, caught unawares and struck by an unusually large rogue wave of immense force. The damage to the ropes is consistent with such an event concluded that all three keepers were washed out to sea in a tragic accident, an act of God. He wrote the clean, simple lie that Hines had wanted, a story of physics, of wind and water. It was a good story, it was logical, it was believable, it was false. His face, reflected dimly in the cabin's porthole, was a mask of deep and quiet conflict. He had solved the puzzle, but the truth he'd found a terrifying, fragile truth about the pressure of isolation, the contagion of fear, and the storm that can rage inside the human mind when the world outside is perfectly calm. That truth could not be entered into a log. It could not be quantified. It could not be explained to men like Hines. He signed his name at the bottom of the report. He had surrendered to the limits of his science. He would give the board their monster from the sea, and he would keep the keepers' real monsters, the ones that had been locked inside with them, as his own silent, solemn burden. As he watched the island shrink on the horizon until it was just a final, lonely speck, he knew he was leaving more than 3 bodies behind. He was leaving the man he used to be. What a story. It leaves you with this fascinating, unsettling question. Which is more real, a rogue wave or a phantom storm? The official report, the one Captain Marshall files, gives us the rogue wave. It has a clean, scientific, and most importantly, a final explanation. It's an answer that allows the Northern Lighthouse Board to close the file and move on. It explains what happened to the men's bodies. It's an accident. But the story that truly stays with us, the one that makes the hair on our arms stand up, is the story of the phantom storm. This is the truth Marshall experienced. It's messy, terrifying, and deeply human. It doesn't give us a neat conclusion. It gives us a haunting insight into what isolation and fear can do to the human mind. It explains what might have happened to the men's souls. It's a tragedy. In the end, Marshall understands this distinction. He sees that the official world requires a story it can measure and file away, even if it's a lie. The deeper, psychological truth is something else entirely, a truth you can only understand by living through it. So, here's my question for you. If you were Captain Marshall, which truth would you have put in your report, the one the world could accept, or the one you knew to be real? Let me know in the comments.